Okay, hello everyone. I am going to be working on my self-portrait painting based on this color study. So this is kind of like step 3 in this painting assignment. You're going to be painting on your 11 by 14 inch panel, um, most likely on a piece of masonite. But so this is essentially the composition that I'm going to be shooting for with this painting. I have my palette to the right of me, so you won't be able to see how I'm mixing my colors and those types of things, but I at least wanted to show you in real time how I'm going to be setting up this painting. This board is actually an example. This is sort of like an example board where I was showing some different textures and mark making. So it's kind of got like a ivory black tone on it. Ideally this would be totally white from the gesso, but I just wanted to mention that this is not something I did for this painting. It's just a piece of primed wood that I wanted to paint on. And since I'll be painting over it, I figured, I should at least mention that, but I'm gonna go ahead and get started. I am using ultramarine blue, titanium white. Here's my palette. Ultramarine blue, titanium white, cadmium yellow medium, and cadmium red medium, which is the slightly darker one over here. So these are my 4 colors that I'll be working on with this painting. And I have a little pile of my oleo gel as my medium. So let's go ahead and get started here. And I have my mirror on my desk set up sort of how I had it before. That way I can reference some of the effects of light that I'm observing in my room here. I mostly have smaller short handle brushes in my vicinity here, so I'm going to use those for now. The other thing I wanted to point out is in my color study, I made these color notes of different values of ultramarine blue and the cadmium red and the cadmium yellow, just as a reminder of how dark I went with the blue. So the first thing I'm going to do is mix up a pretty large pile of ultramarine blue and titanium white that matches this color here. So that way my values will be similar to what I had in this color study. And I could probably do that here to show you at least that part of the process. So it looks a little bit lighter. Grab some more blue. That looks a lot closer now. Maybe just a little bit more blue. Okay. I think I'll probably do kind of a grayish blue to sketch in some of my lines. It can't be too gray because I don't want the lines to blend in with what I had here on the board to begin with, so I'm going to keep it a little bit cooler. Move this out of the way. I'm going to play with my lighting here for a second and see if maybe this is too bright. We'll try this for a little while. Okay. I'm just gonna go in and start sketching out some of my big shapes. Based on my color study that I have. That might be a little too far. Let's go down just a little bit there. This actually might be a little too far in, so let's come back a little bit. There we go, and then I can just kind of wipe this out here. And actually, I'm going to put some gloves on real quick before I continue. Once I start working with my cadmiums, I want to make sure I'm wearing gloves. So then the mirror is going to come out to about there. I'm using a little bit of medium to let the paint glide a little bit better than if it's just the paint itself. You know, you could use solvents here if you want to. I'm finding that just using medium is helping keep some of the intensity of my colors. And down here, there's a line. The other thing that you're going to find is that because this is the third time that you've had to sketch out this design since making the initial thumbnail, some of this should go by pretty quickly, sketching out your design. There's that there. I have a smaller area of shapes over here. Okay, looks pretty good. I'll make a note of this cord that's by the wall over here. And because this area is pretty warm, I don't want to sketch it out with blue because I don't want that to muddy my warmer colors that I'll be putting in this area. So I'm just gonna leave this open for now. Just gonna soften some of this too because I think my measurements aren't exact. Okay. So now let's start mixing up some of my background tones here. And again, I'm just trying to match my initial color study that I have, which maybe I can just set down here. Grab a pair of scissors real quick. Just cut this out. So I can just leave this down here. So you can see what I'm referring to. All right, a little bit of red. So right now I'm working on this background shape over here. And trying to mix up a similar value of a cool tone. that needs to be lighter and not quite as blue. We've got a little bit of yellow. That looks a lot closer now. I don't usually paint with the setup that I have right now, so some things have to kind of move around a little bit. Let's go ahead and grab this color. Just start laying this in here. I'm going to try to work pretty quickly to block everything in today. Depending on how long things take, that might be where I stop the video. And then I can try to do a part 2 where I can show you how I refine things and build off of what I already have. It just depends on what I can get done today. Something I find useful is when you're painting from a color study like this, just try to get as close as you can to the color that you have in a certain part of your painting. You can always paint over it and, you know, add some subtle shifts and variations to things, but don't worry about trying to mix all of your colors that you use the first time before you start your larger painting. I think in terms of our schedule, you should really just try to start working as soon as possible and start laying in some of those colors that you see without trying to worry about perfecting the right color right away. Because that can definitely slow you down, and you might also find like maybe you like a certain area to be a little bit more neutral or more saturated, you know, or the value should be up a little bit higher. And sometimes you make those discoveries just by working. Okay, that's a little too dark. So now I'm working on this kind of violet gray color here at the bottom of my computer screen. So that looks pretty close. Swipe off this brush that I was already using for the other gray area. And we're just going to go in here. Something you'll notice is I'm not working in one area and finishing this entire area before doing the rest of the painting. I'm kind of trying to pop things in as I go, and I chose to go from this area to this one because the value is very similar and they're both fairly neutral grayish colors, and I knew that if I had leftover paint here, all I needed was to add a little bit more red, you know, maybe a little bit more blue or yellow, just to get this violet the way I wanted it to be. But that's why I decided to move over to this area over here. And if I remember correctly, I'm pretty sure when I did my color study, I filled in this entire area up here, or most of it, before going back on top of it with a yellowish highlight. good. Now I think I'm going to try to get this darker shadow shape laid in. A little bit of red, a little bit of my blue value that I mixed up. Let's see how this compares over here. That looks pretty good too. I'm going to go ahead and just use this for now. Let's grab a new brush. Also need to grab more of my medium. You know, and because this is the first layer, I'm trying to keep my paint fairly thin. So that way this can dry a little bit faster. And if I need to overwork something or rework something, I can go over it a lot earlier than if this was really thick paint. Trying to be sensitive to my edges of these big shapes too. I don't want things to be too rough or too loose, so you just have to kind of keep an eye on some of those things. Pretty happy with that. All right, now I think I'm going to go in and try to get this line here and this line here laid in. So that's also a very violet hue. So I'm grabbing more of my blue and a little bit more red, and if I mix the two together without titanium white, it's a pretty dark value, and I think that's what I did the first time around, because that part of my screen is black and it's one of the darkest areas of my entire view, so I have to make sure that I'm saving my darkest possible value for that part of the painting. And this looks like it's a little too dark, so I'm going to grab a little bit of light. It's a little too warm, so now I have to grab more blue. Yeah, that looks good. Okay. Grab some of my medium. So you can see that the mixture I just made up was a little bit darker than the shadow shape I have down here. So I knew I couldn't use the same exact value there. And on my palette, it's more noticeable how different those colors are. Okay. You know, the edges of this line can be refined when I start putting in the highlight here and then painting in the colors that are going to go above the line. So I can be kind of loose here and just block it in really quickly. which is nice. I'm gonna grab a little bit more blue in this mixture before I start filling this area in here. So with the brush I'm using, it's a small flat brush. The bristles are kind of starting to kind of spread out and get really rough, but I can still get a pretty nice edge with a brush like this. So I'm going to use this to create the edge of my computer here. Now I can grab pretty much just that blue that I mixed up with a little bit of this color mixed into it to fill in this shape here, because this is a very cool part of my color study. So I want to just pop this color in here. It's important that these lines make sense. Actually, excuse me, looking at my reference in person, I can see that the shadow is a little bit different on this part of the computer. So I'm going to go ahead and make this adjustment right now, where the darker shadow is actually, it comes out farther than the shadow that's closer to the mirror. Try to make sure this lines up here. All right, I think now I'm going to try to fill in this big green color. Grab some of my cadmium yellow, some of the blue that I mixed up, and a little bit of red. When you mix blue and yellow together, you're going to get a very rich green, depending on your blue and your yellow. And one way to tone down or desaturate that green is to mix in a little bit of red. So we haven't really talked about complements beyond blue and orange so far in this class. So violet and yellow is another pair of complements, and red and green is another pair of complements. So we're going to start looking at our color wheel a little bit more in the future in this class, and it's good to start practicing with, when you're mixing up your colors, this process of desaturating and neutralizing some of the intense colors on your palette. So the best way to do that is by mixing your complements together. All right. So we end up with this kind of brownish green color here. And I think I'm going to need to mix more. One of the things I really like about my color study is that there's some subtle variations in hue, even in these larger passages. So maybe I'll hold this a little bit closer. Like if we look in this green space here, it's very green in the lower left part of the shape here. And then it starts to get cooler and more neutral as we move over to this side of that space. And I want to make sure that I'm keeping that in the larger painting. I really like those relationships. So making notes of how this color should change as I get further along to this side of the painting. So kind of being loose with some of my edges. This is a very thin, almost like dry brush technique that I'm using right now, where you can really see through the paint. And I usually kind of like the different textures that it creates on the panel or the canvas. Okay, now let's mix up a kind of neutral, cooler version of this color. So I'm having to remix my pile of titanium white and ultramarine blue, so I have more of that color to work with. Grab more titanium white. Let's make a few adjustments here real quick. There we go. Trying to see if there's a way to show more of my palette in this space, but unfortunately, because I have to work on my table, a lot of the mixing is not going to be seen. Oh, it's a little bit better. Okay, so now I have this greenish mixture over here. I'll grab a little bit of my blue just to kind of make this cooler. Maybe a little bit of red. It's not quite as green. It's a little bit more neutral over here. Let's just fill this space in all the way. A bit more red. Medium. Grab some more blue. There are some warmer passages in my color study that I want to try to recreate here, so I'm making sure to grab little amounts of red so that some of the variation is a little bit warmer in some areas. I'm trying to soften some of these passages. Okay, that feels pretty good for this shape here. I'm gonna go ahead and move on to a different part of the painting. Let's start putting in this shape up here. And in my color study, you can see it has sort of a light greenish, warm yellow kind of tone to it. It's still pretty neutral, but I'm gonna grab titanium white first. Some cadmium yellow. If I just mix those two, I can see this just turns into a very bright, buttery yellow color. So that's not quite what I'm looking for. One thing I can do to try to neutralize this right away is to use its complement, which would be violet. So I have some areas or almost like puddles of paint on my palette that are in that violet kind of family. So I'm gonna grab a little bit of this one here to mix in. And it's gonna bring the value down because this is a darker color, but it's also going to neutralize some of the intensity of the cadmium yellow. So obviously already it's very different than the initial pile of yellow and white that I had, but it's still not quite as dark as this area over here. So I'm gonna go ahead and grab a little bit more of this, maybe even a little bit of my green pile there. Mix those in to see how it looks. And by using some of my other piles of paint, what I'm also doing is creating a harmony throughout my colors. And the painting in turn will have a more unified feeling to it because some of the same pigments are being mixed together in different amounts throughout the entire painting. So now it's very close. It's a little lighter. I'm gonna grab a little bit of red because it also seems a little bit warmer, more towards a brown. So I think red will lean it more into the browns. Just a tiny bit more. Red is a very powerful pigment, especially the cadmium reds are very intense pigments, so you don't need very much to start to sway some of your color mixes. Okay, that looks pretty good. I'm just gonna kind of like rub off some of the residue paint from my last mixture so that doesn't influence this color as much. I'm gonna move this back just a little bit. Let's grab some of my medium. I'm mixing right into that same pile. We can go up here and start to fill this in. So again, the first thing I'm trying to do is just go in and fill in all of my shapes, right? And get like the most general hue of each shape filled in. That way my painting already can start to build off of the same relationships of color that I had in my color study. And it helps to start to fill in the entire painting first before you start working on one area and refining one area of your painting. So let's just keep trucking along and plugging in our shapes of color here. Something that I try to pay attention to while I'm rebuilding a painting off of a color study is looking at my larger painting and finding areas where I really like the quality of the edges or the smaller, more subtle interactions of my shapes. Like I don't mind some of these little accidental shapes that are happening along the edge of this color and my larger shape in the screen. So I think I'm probably going to leave some of that blue shining through, that blue that I use to sketch out my shapes. It's kind of popping through between some of these larger passages of color. So when you're working, try to always pay attention to some of that stuff. I think you'll be surprised how certain effects can happen and how you can learn from just accidents, you know, things you're not really planning to do but work really well in the painting for whatever reason. And if you're just so focused on remaking something you've already done, sometimes you forget to look for those moments where a really interesting relationship starts to happen. Okay, so let's go ahead and fill this shape in. Now that one's a lot more over here. It's a lot more kind of like orange and intense in terms of its saturation compared to this color up here. And you can probably tell that in my color study, this bar along the top of the sketch is a lot darker than this shape ended up being, which to me right now, that doesn't really bother me that much. Once I put this color in and this one and like fill in the rest of the painting, I'll go back and review how much I need to change this color here along the top. Okay, so I'm gonna grab cadmium yellow. Because this is a fairly darker color up here in this square shape, I don't want to start with titanium white. So I'm going to start with cadmium yellow. I'll bring this over so you can see how I'm going to mix this up. And a little bit of my cad red medium to make this orange. And I'm mixing this kind of near a pile of green and near a pile of blue, so it's going to start to become green, which doesn't bother me that much because that square is not very intense. And I don't want it to be more intense than the orange and yellows that I have in the portrait down at the bottom. So I'm okay with this kind of mixing a little bit into the blue and the green piles of paint on my palette. I'm gonna grab a little bit of titanium white to brighten this back up a little bit. And I think it needs some more red. The nice thing about painting with primaries and like a limited palette like this is that you don't have as many colors that are influencing your mixes. So it's pretty easy to go back and remix a certain color of a past sketch or color study because you only have 3 main hues that are very, very different. So if a color looks orange, you know you have to mix with your yellows and your reds. If you have a color that's green, you know you have to mix with your yellows and your blues. So when you're trying to match a color that you did before, start with whichever area in terms of temperature that mix is closest to. So here, I know this is closest to yellow and closest to red, more than blue. So I'm not going to use any blue to try to mix that color again. So that's what I think about when I'm trying to remix certain colors. Now if I hold this against here, it's a lot more brown, it's a lot darker, so I'm gonna grab more white and maybe a little bit of yellow, maybe a little bit of red. But each time I add something, I try to at least mix it all the way through and then hold it against whatever I'm trying to mix. So I think it needs a little bit more red. Okay, it's closer, still a little bit darker, so I'm gonna grab some more white. Not too much. That looks pretty close. So since this is really close, I'm gonna go ahead and just use this for now. And again, I can always mix up variations of this later to fill in this shape up here. I'm gonna go ahead and just use this same brush that I had when I filled in this horizontal shape along the top of the painting. Grab some of my medium, mix into that pile of paint, and then just start filling this in. Now again, I want this to be pretty thin, right? I don't want to be mixing really, really thick amounts of paint at this point because I know I want to have to make corrections, or I know I'm going to have to make corrections on some of my colors, and it's going to be easier to mix a correction into a certain spot if there's not a ton of paint already there. Grab some more medium. I'm going to fill this entire thing in, even though I know that there's a shadow shape along the top. I can probably blend a darker value into that today, since it's not like the whole thing has to change. It's just along this top part of the shape that I'm going to want to go in and add another color. One thing I liked about my color study was that my edges on the screen were kind of soft. They weren't super, super harsh. So I'm going to go in, just kind of lightly brush along the edge of these two shapes to soften this out a little bit. Because I don't really want this area to be a focal point as much as the lower right side. I still want your eye to come up over here, but if this is really, really defined and the edges are really, really sharp, then I think that's going to take away from the portrait that I have at the bottom right that I'll be painting in. I'm going to grab a little bit of blue and a little bit of red and mix it into this pile so that it darkens this color I just laid in. And it needs to be a little bit warmer, so I'm gonna grab some more red. I don't want it to match the top part of this color here, so I think if I grab more red, that should help the viewer know that those are two different shapes, right? If it ends up being too similar to this bar up here, it's gonna seem like they're the same thing, or they're the same object, or they're the same shape, and it's not what I want. So I have to make sure I'm paying attention to how the color and the temperature is going to push them away from each other, so that way when you look at this, you're going to think, oh yeah, maybe that's a separate form, or maybe that's part of a shadow or something. Being kind of gestural a little bit with that, so I'm going to leave that there for now. That looks pretty good. Now let's go ahead and mix in this yellow, smaller rectangle here at the bottom. And in my sketch, it's a lot taller. And right now I have it kind of shorter. I think I'm gonna end up making it taller in this part of the painting. So right now with a fairly dry brush, I'm gonna go in and just kind of spread this greenish color around a little bit to make it thinner. That way, if I make this part taller, there's not as much paint on the surface. So it's almost like I'm erasing some of that paint just by spreading it around with a dry brush. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and grab more cadmium yellow and mix it right into this color that I just was working on my palette. Since it's already sort of a yellowish color. But I'm gonna grab a little bit of this like extra greenish gray to make it darker, but also to make it a little bit more neutral. I don't want it to be green though, so I have to add in some more red. The danger of where I'm mixing on my palette right now is that I'm mixing this yellow right next to this big blue area of paint. So blue keeps getting mixed in and making it green. And that's why I have to go in and grab more red or yellow. But let's grab a little bit more red. Grab some of my medium. I'm just going to go through and fill this whole shape in right away. Because what I can do is, on top of this, I can add in a more saturated yellow to create that intense shape. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. I think right away I'm going to go ahead and grab some yellow and a little bit of medium. My brush still has some of this color in the hairs, so it's going to kind of weaken the intensity of the yellow, which is good because sometimes going right from the tube and grabbing that really, really intense yellow or red right away, you're kind of using all of the power of the color when you do that. And, you know, I find it's more helpful to save that power for moments where you really, really want to turn up the intensity in a certain part of your painting. So there we go. That looks good. All right, since we're talking about yellows, I might as well go in and try to pop in this highlight here with titanium white, and I'm going to do it over in this section here because I still want it to have a little bit of a purplish mauve kind of hue, just with a tad bit of yellow put in. And that actually looks pretty good. So I'm going to grab this color. Since this has a kind of a yellowish hue on this brush, I'm going to just wipe off excess paint. Grab some medium, mix into here, and let's just go ahead right on top of this. Now, because there's no paint on the surface in this darker grayish area here, I didn't paint the lighter violet all the way up to this edge. I kind of left the panel dry in this spot. That's going to help keep this color from getting gray and kind of neutral, because when you do mix this color with this violet here, it is going to gray out even more. And I didn't want that to happen. I wanted there still to be this yellowish hue. So I decided not to paint all the way to the top of the shape. Now let's go ahead and just run the brush along this edge. Now, one thing I'm noticing is that the width of this line here and this line here are like those two widths are different, and I need to end up cutting into this shape a little bit more to match this one here, or I need to make this one wider. So I think what I'm going to do is try to first cut into this one a little bit more. And I have to be careful because I'm mixing this yellow right into that violet, which, like I said earlier, is going to neutralize the yellow. So I'm having to grab more yellow and keep loading my brush so that I don't end up mixing a very grayish color through this whole area. But at this point, I think it's more important to worry about your shapes and the proportions of your shapes than the color. So I'm trying to do both. I'm trying to get my colors pretty close to what I want them to be, but also trying to correct a lot of my shapes and make sure that my proportions are correct. But this worked out okay. I'm going to be kind of loose with some of the yellow, how it mixes into here. I do want to keep this edge pretty clean for the shadow, however. I'm just going to grab a couple brush strokes of yellow, move it, kind of like have it gradually get lost into this violet shape here. That's going to harmonize that transition a lot better than if you just had a straight line on where you wanted the yellow to end and have the purple start. You know, and having kind of a painterly effect in some of these areas is okay too, you know. It's really up to you what style and visual language you want to have in your painting. Some people are really loose and gestural. Some people are very, very refined and have very tight shape relationships. That's okay too. But keep in mind you have some flexibility there in how these shapes are going to interact with each other. Okay, I think for now I'm going to leave that area alone. I'm pretty happy with that right now. Before I keep going and start eventually working on the warmer part of the painting, I do want to pop in this cool shape at the bottom, which looks like it's pretty much the blue that's just tinted up a little bit with titanium white. So I'm going to grab some white and mix right into the edge of this blue pile here. I'm pretty happy with that right away, so I'm going to go ahead and just use that. A little bit of medium. I'm going to move this out of the way for a moment and lift this up so I can paint all the way to the edge. A little bit more medium. Okay, so I think I'm gonna have to go in and put in more of that lighter violet color along this area here. That's actually different piles, so let's grab some white. Well, and actually in my color study I had this getting a little bit darker towards the bottom, so maybe I'll try to keep that in there, but not make it quite as much of a jump in value. Kind of like I did with the yellow, I'm going to try to work this up into the mixture so that there's a bit of a gradation there that's a little bit more unified and balanced. So trying to pay attention to this line here and make sure that my shadow's looking okay. All right, I think that's pretty good for the background of the painting. I'm just going to stand up and look at it from a distance here. One thing I'm noticing is that this line definitely has to straighten out a little bit, so I'm just going to use my paper towel and wipe away some of the background, which should help me find the right edge. And then this blue also won't interfere with the warmer tones I'm going to be putting in, or the warmer hues I'll be putting in. Okay, that feels a lot better now. So far, I'm pretty happy with how this is starting to, match my color study. I think that they're pretty similar in terms of the colors I've been putting in. So again, this is also a really good step to do these color studies because it helps us to get used to how to remix certain colors that we've used in the past. So by limiting your palette to only a few colors, you can help keep this process a little bit more consistent and easier to remix. So now let's go ahead and start mixing in some of the tones and hues that are in this part of the painting. All right, I think first what I'm going to do is try to clean my palette a little bit though. Just going to mix a few of these colors together to create a grayish, greenish color. And I can use this to help tone down some of my hues and bring them into more of a neutral area instead of using a complement. You could do this too. Have a pile of a grayish tone on your palette, and that will help tone down your colors. So let me scoop this up and set that there. Let's take my paper towel and wipe this clean. Okay, now I have a much cleaner workspace. You know, this is what happens if you let piles dry and you don't wipe down your palette every day. You end up, it takes a long time to kind of paint over and get rid of some of these piles of paint. So now these are very distracting when I'm mixing some of my colors, but just know that this is dry here. Okay, so now let's grab my cadmium red. And some of my blue to create a violet that I'm seeing in the hair. So I don't want to just take away all of my red. I want to try to save some of that red for other colors. Trying to make a warmer version here for the hair. All right, that looks pretty good. So sort of like I've been doing with other parts of the painting, I don't want to be too careful and slow and precarious about this. I want to just jump right in and start moving paint around. So I'm gonna grab some medium and thin this out a little bit so that it glides a lot easier and I can kind of sketch things out. And looking at my color study, I can use that as a reference for where my shapes should be lining up. Some more medium. Let's try to find that angle up here. And I'm using the paint in a very thinned out consistency right now because I don't know exactly where I'm putting some of my edges. I have to kind of paint around a little bit to find where something is gonna, you know, how wide something is or how long something is. And if you're using really, really thick amounts of paint, it can be challenging then to make those corrections because your colors are going to mix together. So when you're sketching things out like this, it's definitely helpful to have your paint be pretty thinned out. And one of the things I mentioned when I made my color study that I liked was how gestural my shapes were and how loose some of the depiction was. So I'm trying to kind of recreate that feeling of kind of sketchiness and looseness in my shapes. Okay, got that there. This can come down a little bit. So the forehead shape needs to be opened up a little bit more. All right, that's not too bad. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and pop in this yellow shape over here next. And I can definitely try to keep this fairly intense. I don't really want this to be neutral. I want this to be one of the more intense areas of the painting. So I'm gonna try hard not to mix in any complements or any neutrals into this mixture here. And what I might do for this part of the painting is start off with a really intense shape, and then I could go on top of that later or back into it while it's wet and add in some colors that are gonna neutralize it a little bit more depending on how it looks once this is in there. This is gonna come down to about here. Let's grab some more medium. This is much more yellow than I have in my color sketch, but I think for right now I'm okay with that. I'll probably make it more orange in the future. Okay. I can also start to kind of pop in some colors that I see that are yellow in the face. Okay, let's see. There's another color in my palette still that's kind of a greenish color that I'm going to use to fill in parts of the face over here. A little bit more red. So right now I'm mostly looking at my color study and trying to recreate some of the shapes and relationships I had in the color study, just to get my basic color relationships figured out. And this is kind of orange down here. Got an orange there. Kind of an orange over there. A little bit of blue. Okay, I'm pretty happy with how the face is turning out. It's very simple, but I like the simplicity of the colors that I have there. I don't want to overwork it right now. I want to keep it fairly open in terms of being able to shift things around and make some adjustments. So I'm gonna start to move over to other parts of the portrait once I finish filling in some of these shapes that I still have to change. You know, where I can kind of bring in a little bit more opacity in some of these areas. That. Also add in a few lines here and there. All right, let's pop in the red line there and then the orange line. Maybe I'll start with the orange. Or this orange shape, I should say. Bring this up again. Might as well just go all the way up to the yellow and then paint over with the red. I think that'll give this a more like full or whole kind of feeling if I do that. And then this kind of comes in down here. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now let's grab the red. This is pretty much just the red right out of the tube, so I don't really need to mix this with anything. Just trying to keep things somewhat loose here. Okay. I'm noticing that this line is a little bit off here, so I want to fix this. And there is a little bit of a line there to describe where my nose is ending. This is where I'm, trying to say, like, I don't want to overwork it too much, but you also don't want to leave things where they're totally off, because if you don't get a chance to go back and fix them, those are going to be those areas where you're going to say, oh, if I had more time, I would have tried this. And it's better to notice it and just fix it, within the amount of time you have. But again, because this is the first layer of the painting, it also doesn't have to be totally exact, And again, I also like this sort of looseness that the painting can have at this point too. Okay, that's going to come down like this. It's like the back of my neck is right there. Okay. I think this is turning out okay now. I'm just going to fill this whole area in with this violet-y color that I have. Now I'm kind of looking at my mirror and just checking some of these lines to see if I should move a couple of them. Definitely feeling better about this though. All right, now the last thing to do is just pop in this kind of pink color in the background here, and I'll probably end the stream. I do want to go through and just soften this a little bit here. That's better. All right, let's mix up a pink with titanium white and mostly cadmium red. I might be using too much white already. Oops. Let's grab a little bit of blue. I think because I don't want the hair to blend in with the background too much, I'm going to grab a kind of a lighter violet this time, or kind of a pinkish violet to fill in over here. And I'm going to definitely probably end up going over this in the future, but at least this will fill in and kind of give me an idea of where those shapes are meeting. Okay. And now I'm going to go through and just try to soften up some of these edges. Because I haven't decided exactly where the hair is going to stop and then the background will come in. So I'm going to try to keep the edges of those areas a little bit softer for now, just by using my finger to keep that more smooth. So, okay, yeah, this is kind of where I'm going to stop for now. I think that this is a really good way to practice color mixing and, you know, investigating your initial design. And this is also why it's really important to make sure that you're always choosing the design that is most interesting to you, because if you're going to remake it 2 more times, you don't want to get to the final painting and be bored of the design and not think it's interesting enough and dynamic enough. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and I will talk to the students very soon. If you have any questions, let me know. I will talk to you later. All right.